Hello, I'm Jason Rankin, and welcome to the GrassCheck podcast, brought to you by AgResearch. We are bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve grazing management on your farm. This week we are joined by David Patterson from AFBI, Robert Patterson from CAFRE, Andrew Dale, a dairy farmer from Limavady, and John and William Egerton, Bashan sheep farmers from Rosslea in County Fermanagh. David, Robert, Andrew, John and William, many thanks for joining us. David, in the last 2 weeks we've had warmer and slightly drier conditions. Has growth responded to these kinder conditions?
Yes, to some extent. Growth rates over this last couple of weeks, in fairness, have been below average. So I think we're still transitioning out of that previously poor period of weather, which I think is mostly down to the soil condition and that it was heavily saturated on a lot of farms in most of the counties around Northern Ireland. But I suppose the good news is that despite modest below average growth rates over this last couple of weeks, the forecast for the next 7 days at least is to zoom away off the scale, way above the 10-year seasonal average to about 100. So with every plus, there's a minus. And unfortunately, the forecast for cooler temperatures, which is the critical thing for growth, in the 7 days beyond that, well into next week, is for cooler conditions and unfortunately back down to 50 to 60 kilograms of growth. But the caveat on that, trying to stay positive here, for the 7-day forecast is always more reliable because it's hugely hinged onto the Met Office predictions, and it can only get better than that 50 to 60 predicted figure for the following 7 days.
In terms of grass quality, obviously the growth is picking up. We seem to have a mixed bag in terms of grass quality, improving in some areas, but concerns in others. Do you want to outline what we've kind of seen in grass quality so far this year?
Okay, yeah. Concerns is the key word there. I have been looking across all of the graphs this last day or so on plot growths, different sites, and the on-farms data right around the province. And yeah, ME is more or less where we'd expect it to be. The metabolizable energy in the grass, it's hovering in around 11.5 on most of the sites and most of the plots, and that's good news. The dry matter is slightly lower than expected for this time of year. The water-soluble carbohydrates, the sugars in the grasses, they are on an upward trajectory right now, but they are a couple of percentage points lower than where I would expect them to be at this point of early to mid-May. But, and here's the slightly not good news, crude protein is a good 3 to 4% lower than it should be for this stage of the season. And you start to try and unpick that as to what's going on, because it's showing up on some of the on-farms figures, and it's certainly showing up in our much more controlled plot quality samples as well. So there's a concern there on the protein level, because that's going to reflect not only in the herbage grazing quality, but also I expect in silage crops that have been harvested recently and could tell a tale in the analyses that come through later on in the summer. But for the here and now, it's considerably below where it should be. And to try and explain that is the follow-up question. I've been scratching my head about that, and I think it's probably, it's likely to be all about nitrogen. If I go back to our plots just for a moment, we have fertilized them as normal. They have the same grass in the plots, obviously, as previous years. I think what has changed is the combination of the recent weather patterns and conditions, especially rainfall. And it comes down to the soil and the nitrogen. Crude protein in the grass is all about nitrogen, whether it comes from organic slurries, pellet fertilizer, or clover nitrogen, or even the collective soil nitrogen pool that's down in the soil itself. So that nitrogen's coming from all those various sources, and I think, my pet theory is that the consistently heavy rainfall that we had over this last, 6 or 8 weeks, the spell during which people were applying slurries when they could and were applying fertilizer when they could, we might not have got the full value out of the N that has been applied and converted into protein in the herbage itself. So I think we're running a bit low on nitrogen. Nitrogen is the short answer.
Thank you, David. Moving on to Robert now. Robert, hopefully all farms have got stock out now. Some farmers are in the situation where they have lots of grass in front of them. Others who have got out slightly earlier are maybe now running tight. Although hopefully, obviously, the growth, the predicted surge in growth will help that. What are the key steps farmers will need to take to ensure good grass quality as we enter the main grazing season?
Yeah, as you say, Jason, it's obviously been a very difficult start to the grazing season, and there's several different scenarios out on farm at the minute. The transition from first to second rotation has been particularly difficult for a lot of people because that unhelpful spell of rainfall last weekend made going on to any second rotations that had been damaged the first time very difficult. Livestock weren't settled, and putting livestock back onto first rotation grass was very difficult to get good residuals on. To add to that, there were people who took maybe surplus paddocks out about a fortnight ago, which coincided with that cold spell, and maybe those paddocks haven't come back just as they would have hoped. So there are some people out there getting into a bit of a deficit. The main thing now at this stage, going into this main part of the grazing season, is trying to keep on top of quality as we enter the period of the season where the grass plant tries to reproduce and go to seed. So at the minute, it's all about residuals and targeting good residuals where possible. With weather like we have today, that's not as big an issue. But if we are still trying to get through those first rotation paddocks, it is still quite difficult. So looking at the options there, we could look at pre-mowing. The caveat with pre-mowing is that it probably will reduce your growth in the subsequent couple of weeks after that, and then sort of targeting those paddocks that were badly dirtied or had a really poor residual in the previous rotation, and trying to earmark them for taking out as a surplus if there is a surplus existing.
Thanks, Robert. A lot of silage is being cut at the present time. What are the key steps for farmers to take to ensure good quality silage and avoid soil contamination?
Yeah, it's a fantastic time to try and get some good quality grass harvested there at the minute. As we well know, field operations haven't been straightforward for this past 9 months, and there are plenty of fields out there with wet spots where there aren't usually wet spots, and there are ruts from slurry applications and fertilizer applications and grazing, whatever it may be. So it's just keeping an eye on soil contamination, just practical things like looking at the heights of mowers, the heights of tedders and rakes, and just trying to minimise the amount of soil coming back into the clamp or the bale there. And also for slurry applications, if slurry has gone on fairly late in the season, just being mindful that you're not setting the rake down too low and you're bringing a lot of that sort of dry material back in.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Andrew, turning to you now, how has the grazing season gone for you so far, and how have you managed?
Afternoon, Jason. Well, it'll not take me too long to summarise the grazing season so far on this farm, in that it only started on Monday. But basically, a wee bit of an outline of the system here: 120 milking cows, crossbred cows, Viking Red, Viking Holstein, and the history of the herd would be more fleck feed crossbred. So we have quite big cows, so we're sprinkling a bit of Jersey in there as well, just to reduce the overall cow size. So the farm itself is about 300 acres. We grow about 60 acres of whole crop. So in terms of the grazing platform here, we're very restricted. We've only 35 acres available for grazing. So if you work that out, 120 cows over 35 acres is about 8 cows to the hectare or something. So we then, to try and bring in extra grazing area, we zero graze. So we have been zero grazing since late April, sort of the 20th of April there, on and off, just whenever we could. And we were all set to start the grazing rotation last week. But basically it rained here nearly every day last week, pretty heavy some of the days. So basically we kept nipping away at the zero grazing when we could on the drier fields. And we actually nipped off a few of the grazing fields as well, just because they were getting covers of 3,500 or 4,000. So a combination of high covers and poor ground conditions weren't going to be ideal for turning cows out. So we just nipped it off with the zero grazer and kept the cows in. But we've got the cows out now since Monday by day, out full time since Wednesday. And we're now starting to transition them on. There's still a wee bit of whole crop oats that they're getting there during milking, but that'll be cut out now over the next day or two and bring them down from currently 5 kilos a meal down to 2 or 3 kilos. Just depends on how unsettled maybe the weather turns next week. But the idea would be to get them onto a full grass diet out day and night, and also then zero graze some grass then during milking time, just to make sure they're full of grass from next week. So but it's been a crazy spring here, if you want to call it a spring. But we have, just to summarise this week, which emphasises how crazy it has been, really. Yesterday evening we mowed some of our drier part of the farm, which got slurry in middle of February and got topped up with fertiliser in the middle of March, which would be the target for silage ground. So it was mowed last night. We're going to put and sile it tomorrow. But also yesterday, the wetter parts of the farm got the very first fertiliser of the year. We tried 2 or 3 times to get slurry onto it, but it was always too wet. And I still was driving through puddles yesterday to get the fertiliser onto it. So that in itself is going to be a bit of a challenge moving forward. We're obviously the first block of silage ground has been cut now. 10 days time there'll be another block cut, and then that late stuff that's only just received fertiliser, it'll probably not be ready for cutting to the end of May. So we'll just see what grass quality is like. I would imagine it'll start to throw seed head regardless of whether it's 6 inches tall or 1.5 foot tall. So we'll just see. It might end up, it's not a big area, so it might end up going to bale it for dry cow feed or something. But it's just been a challenge. And on top of that, we are currently trying to sow some spring oats into ground that was ploughed in the middle of September for winter wheat. So that sort of summarises just where the struggles have been over the last sort of 7-8 months on this particular area. And in terms of growth, just to back up what David was saying, we measure weekly here. So growth rates were 30, 40 kilos maximum throughout April there. Combination, I suppose, of cold, wet soils and plus disjointed fertiliser applications. But measured it at the start of the week there and we were getting 63. And with the heat that we've had in the last few days, I would imagine we'll be recording a growth of 80 plus now at the weekend and a couple of days whenever we measure again. So growth has at last started to take off, and we'll just monitor pre-grazing heights or whatever. We're sitting at low 3,000s there at the minute. So, and we're out full time. So if we've got enough grass in the grazing platform, we'll even skip round, because you could skip round in 18 days. So we'll be, rather than split a field into 4, we'll just split it into 3 and keep them moving, but also try and hit the residuals if we can. And if covers get a bit high, we'll skip a field, we'll zero graze it or we'll bale it or something, because we're going to be cutting silage on and off sort of every 10 days now for the next few weeks anyway. So that's the way we'll hopefully control it and get everything back into some sort of shape. Again, there's a lot of slurry still in store that we weren't able to get out in the spring. So again, we have a Leslie tanker now with trail and shoe, so we'll try and apply some of it maybe when we can after the cows, or definitely after the zero grazer, and make use of it, try and reduce our bought fertiliser requirements if we can now. And that's kind of summarises where we're at the minute.
Thank you, Andrew. As you say, a very challenging year all round, particularly for those of you in wetter parts of the country. John, William, coming on now to you and how things have gone for you. Now, obviously, we're going to split in this farm because John, I know you look after mainly the beef cattle, and William the sheep. So, John, do you want to maybe start from the kind of the beef end of things as to how things have gone for you this year?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Yeah, it has been a difficult year. Most years are difficult here anyway. We've had cattle out from early April. out and in and doing the hokey cokey and moving around and doing damage. And we were lucky we got out early with slurry, and we got out early with fertilizer, and the grass growth has been reasonable here, even with the wet conditions. I was happy enough with the grass growth. The biggest problem was utilisation and leaving heavier residuals than I would have liked, doing a bit of damage. We started about 2 weeks ago taking paddocks out, which has worked very well. We've cut paddocks off and we've got those slurried, and they're coming again well. Our growth last week was actually 75, but our growth never got down below about 40 anyway, so we were happy enough. The issue has been all cattle have been out now for about 2 weeks, and the issue is that some of them have been going into covers of 3,000 to 4,000, and a paddock that should have lasted them 3 days hasn't lasted them 2 days, or even after a day and a half they've been looking for a change and tramping about. The issue now will be those paddocks the next time round. By right, those should be cut the next time round, but there's a bit of surface damage and there's a bit of dirt on the grass, and it wouldn't make very good quality silage. So we're in a difficult situation there. This last few days it has improved. Utilisation has definitely massively improved. We're almost around the first rotation. The last 3 paddocks of the first rotation, I actually cut them this morning. So we'll be moving tomorrow. We'll be moving into the second rotation, which should help improve the thing. The paddocks that were cut a couple of weeks ago have come well and are ready for grazing again now, even though it's only 2 weeks. But hopefully there's not going to come too much rain. My graph hasn't been that pleasant to look at recently. It's just been showing a massive surplus, even though realistically I hadn't a lot of surplus. But hopefully next week that with cutting out these paddocks, the graph will be more where I want it to be.
Okay, thank you. William, how's things been going on the sheep end of the farm?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Like everyone else said, it has been a very challenging spring. Getting ewes and lambs turned out early on in middle of March was very difficult. Ground was saturated. Young lambs, they don't survive well out in the rain. And grass growth, as my father says, has sort of been all right here. Utilisation was tough going. Some fields did get too wet to be grazed at all, and when they did eventually dry up, they were cut sort of towards the end, middle of April. And I have noticed that they were a wee bit slower to come back again, just with the cold weather. But thankfully now the heat has came, the sun has came out, and I should be doing okay for grass. I'd be expecting grass to be up high 80s, high 90s this week for growth.
And Joe, William, what are your plans? When are you likely to be cutting silage on your farm? Have you closed up anything for silage at the present time?
Yeah, the silage ground only got applications to fertiliser about 3 weeks ago, so it's probably another 2 weeks out yet. We hoped in the meantime to be cutting away at paddocks almost every week. No, we normally aim for the last week in May, and it's looking like that's when it's going to be this year. It's bulking up fairly well now. There's some of the wetter ground that didn't get slurry is a bit hungry looking, and it's probably going to run the seed head, and it's not going to be as good a quality. But hopefully it will improve. Some of them said there about the protein in our samples so far. The protein have been reasonable. I haven't had any issue with the protein. I'm not sure whether that's the fact that we got out early with urea and slurry. Maybe that has helped the protein, but the protein in our samples have been reasonable so far.
Robert, we're now entering an ideal time of year for overseeding clover. What are the key steps to take to maximise the chance of successful stitching in of clover?
Yeah, as you say, Jason, it's coming into the ideal time. Perhaps usually in a normal year it would have been maybe a fortnight ago, but in terms of soil moisture and soil temperature and daylight hours, those are the three things we need to think about, and we've got all those things at the minute. So if we're thinking about overseeding, traditionally it would be a white clover variety, and hopefully you'll have some idea of paddock selection before this point. But in terms of paddock selection, you'll be thinking about the soil nutrient status of the paddocks. So ideally 2+ for P and K, and above 6.3 for pH. The prevalence of weeds in the paddock is a consideration as well, because there's limited ways to control the weeds when the clover comes through. So ideally a cleaner sward. Looking at the sward in terms of the proportion of sown species currently in the sward, and if you're going to be happy with that sward, say for the next 5 or 6 years, if you get a good hit of clover in terms of perennial ryegrass in it, and also the sward density. So the denser the sward, the more difficult overseeding clover is, trying to get it established. And I suppose then getting it sown, getting plenty of soil contact, probably using an ironbark, scratch the surface a couple of times, and then really it's about grazing management thereafter. So trying to graze it at shorter grazing rotations, sort of 18 days, lower pre-grazing covers, 26 to 2800 kilos of dry matter to the hectare, and reducing the nitrogen going on to those paddocks. So ideally no nitrogen sort of a month before establishment, no nitrogen when it's sown, and after the second grazing post-sowing, then maybe going on with a half rate of nitrogen, sort of 15 kilos to the hectare, if you need the grass growth there, all in an aim to try and reduce the competition from the grass plants there, and give the clover as much of a fighting chance as possible, and getting as much light into the base of the sward. So a really quick turnaround with the overseeding. You can be back in there grazing in 2 or 3 weeks' time, if you're able to get in and get the seed sown as soon as the paddock is grazed or mown or whatever the case may be. The full sward reseed is still an option at this time of year, and it's probably a belt and braces approach, but it's, you're probably going to have a greater chance of a good establishment, but you're probably looking at this time of year of being out of that paddock for 8 to 10 weeks. So it's just what implications that will have on your stocking rate and your demand at this time of year.
No, I was just going to add, Robert has given a really good coverage there. We were oversowing yesterday, actually last night, at Hillsbury here with, it's a little bit different. It was pure plantain seed that we were stitching into a ryegrass sward. It's part of the DARA-funded plantain grazing study, just for context. But the point is, what I did notice, and even looking around the GrassCheck bulletin for this week, soil moisture right around the country on the sites that we test has come up closer to field capacity. And I think even looking at that soil last night, soil's in a perfect condition right now for overseeding, because it is not crumbly, it's not too hard at the surface, and it's almost, I would call it, at the plasticine stage. It has the water table finally has got a little bit lower down the soil profile, and that plastic nature of the very surface soil, it was allowing the first 2 passes of the empty ironbark, as I call it. The first 2 passes were just scoring into it nicely, and then the third pass was dropping the seed in. So it's perfect timing from a soil surface condition point of view. A coulter or a tine or any sort of whatever machine it is, whatever's cutting into the surface, is just allowing that nice little groove to go in and drop the seed in. So it's really good timing right now. And also, just to re-emphasize Robert's other point, the aftercare is nearly as important, if not more important. And what we're intending to do, this is an experimental paddock, if you like, but we're going to go in and cut it probably as much as every 10 days, just to keep the grass competition back. A ryegrass regrowth after a light silage cut, heavy grazing cover, whatever it may be, is hugely competitive. And it's amazing how quickly those ryegrass tillers just close over. and a little tiny seedling the size of your wee fingernail is trying hard to compete, whether it's a clover seedling or a plantain, doesn't matter. They're having a huge job to do, and that's why I think a lot of overseeding has not been successful in the past. We haven't kept the grass competition back.
Andrew, have you been taking any steps to establish clover on your farm?
We have. If you walked my fields, you would think that I haven't. But I've been doing a lot of the work that Robert basically summarised there at the start of his talk about there's no point of buying clover seed if the soil P and Ks and pHs and weed control isn't right. So over the last 2-3 years, we've been working hard at trying to get all those ducks in a row, if you like. And really the farm is, I think, in a pretty good place now to try and include clover successfully. The other thing, if you remember, I highlighted the fact we have quite a tight grazing platform here. So again, we were feeding it hard with nitrogen in the past because we were restricted in area. But because of the zero grazing and the flexibility it gives us now, we're not just pushing the nitrogen as hard. So again, because basically you can do all the hard work you like about clover, but if you basically flood the thing with nitrogen, then the grass is just going to outcompete it. So I think the overall system is much more inviting, if you like, to make clover a success. So definitely this year we intend, there's a local contractor has got one of these stitching in machines. So definitely we intend to actually, as we get round sort of over the next 10 days, I'll be hopefully trying to do a bit, especially as the guys have all said there, soil conditions are almost ideal at the minute for it. So we'll try and do a bit and see how we get on. Again, whenever we do a full reseed in the past, we would have always have used a bit of clover. I reseeded a big area a couple of years ago, actually, and weed control was an issue in the field. So we just sowed it straight with grass, and we've got the weeds under control now. So I intend now this year to try and stitch a bit of, it was a hybrid grass actually, so it's quite open. So, and it's now in its second year. So again, we'll probably go in and try and stitch in a wee bit of more hybrid and a wee bit of clover this time, just through it. It doesn't need plowed on, so we'll just try and renovate it, rejuvenate it that way. And hopefully get another 2-3 years out of it. But with the clover this time, now we've got the weeds under control. So I'd also be very keen on maybe red clover. But again, the flexibility on this farm is key. And obviously, at my time at Hillsborough, I had plenty of experience with red clover. And yes, it's a wonderful crop. It can grow in fresh air, but you need to have the right weather window for that 24, 48 hours whenever it's ready for cutting. And unlike grass, it is such a small window. Whenever it's ready, it needs cut. And if that happens to be 2 wet days, then unfortunately, it'll be very difficult to make anything that's palatable at all for livestock. So again, it's something that I am thinking of dabbling with. But my issue is that the best site I have for it in terms of ground, the type of ground, it's a 40-acre block. So it's sort of go big or go home type thing. It's either to do half of it's only a nuisance. So I don't know. It's still, because again, there's yes, you can reduce your inputs, but you got to end up with something that you can feed to livestock at the end of it. And I've threw out too many bad black bales from my time at Hillsborough to know that that's not what conducive at all. So we'll just have to see. But no, the red clover thing is definitely something that I would be keen to dabble with, I think, going forward. But definitely white clover across the farm is something that as a starting point, we're hoping to go on that journey this year for sure.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. John, William, have you been taking any steps to establish clover?
Yeah, well, I'll maybe start here, but we have been establishing clover for the last 2 years of that white clover, and everything Robert says is exactly right. The big issue we have is after the 18 days when you're ready to graze it, quite often it's wet, and when you go in and graze that young clover plant and it's wet, you're trampling the ground and you're damaging the clover, and it's difficult to get it established in those conditions. Then if you wait to the dry conditions, the clover's smothered out. So it has worked well in some areas, and in other areas it has been difficult to establish. We usually found that June was actually the best month of the year to establish the clover, and that's probably because ground conditions are usually better, and it's easier to get back in those 18 days and graze it off and give it a chance. Usually in May the weather can be changeable, and to come back in on wet conditions, it has been difficult. William has been establishing it in the sheep ground as well, and he's had difficulties, but I'll let him say that himself.
A couple of years ago, I stitched in quite a bit of clover on the sheep ground. I maybe took on a wee bit too much than what I should have, as I wasn't fit to graze some of it off in time, and it did get smothered out. And another issue with the sheep end is sheep would tend to thicken grass out a lot, and it is getting that soil contact and getting the light down in, even when it is grazed off. The grass can be very dense of itself. Some paddocks worked well and others not so well, and then that wet winter, I'll question how much of the clover has actually survived through the winter.
David, for those farmers looking to do a full reseed, obviously we've no recommended list in Northern Ireland anymore, but what are the key things they should be looking for when selecting a grass seed mix?
Yeah, I'll be as brief as possible. It's a big subject. You should probably still look for recommended list varieties. There are other lists available in the south, and there's the Scottish list, the AHDB list. So you can still check out if the varieties that are available perhaps through local merchants or seed houses, to make sure they are actually recommended on a list. After that, you're trying to pick off the top of those lists. Obviously, if it's a silage type sward, it's trying to match the heading out dates of the varieties with the likely time that you take first cut, or your expected sort of week when you normally are able to achieve first cut silage. I think that's a critical point to watch, those heading out dates. For a grazing type scenario, it's maybe a case of with or without clover. For a start off, if it's with clover, it's maybe doubling the seed rate in a mixture. If it's a 12 to 14 kilo mixture, rather than 1 or 1.5, it's maybe 3 kilograms of white clover going into that full mixture. And watching the varieties there as well, in that you want, William will maybe shoot me about this, but it's wanting, desiring to put some more open growing varieties and species, for that matter. It's Timothy as well as perennial ryegrass, and on the ryegrass varieties, having the slightly later heading, more open types such as the tetraploids. So upping the proportion of those. And again, back to basics, mixtures shouldn't be complicated. 2 to 3 grass varieties is really all you need. And if we're talking about a more extensive area, yes, it's about clover, but also looking at those other grass species. If you have a particularly dry field, that whenever there's a 2-week period in the summer without rain, the field's going brown, or something as extreme as that, you should be looking to deeper rooting grasses, Festuloleum, tall fescue, and even cocksfoot. Some of the more palatable, more digestible varieties of cocksfoot are available. On the silage front, we took silage off here at Hillsborough of most of the first cut area this week. Conditions were good, but the point is, when we looked at some of the more advanced tillers, the growing point still hadn't emerged. It was probably about 4/5 of the way up through its travel, and that was on the mature big tillers that you lift out of the sward. So it should be, for those people that are cutting now or very recently or about to, I think the quality level in ryegrass should be pretty good at the moment.
That's it for this episode of the GrassCheck podcast. And my thanks to David Patterson from AFBI, Robert Patterson from CAFRE, Andrew Dale, and John and William Egerton for joining us. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast. You can listen on Apple, Amazon, and Google Podcasts, as well as Spotify. For more information, you can go to the GrassCheck website, www.agrisearch.org/GrassCheck. our GrassCheck social media channels. I'm Jason Rankin, and join us the next time for the GrassCheck podcast. Until then, stay safe.